This lecture will give you the principles for the placement of maxillary and mandibular anterior teeth into the complete denture setup. What are we going to look for, or what are the things that are important when we're considering where to set anterior teeth? They are the distance from the incisive papillae, the midline, the overbite or overjet, the arch form. We'll also be looking at the correct mesiodistal and labiolingual inclination of the tooth when we set it. The incisal guide pin and the incisal guide table must contact when we're setting teeth. And we will be looking for kissing contacts when the teeth are placed in protrusion. Also, the symmetry of the arch. Positioning of the 6 maxillary and mandibular teeth are very important for aesthetics, phonetics, and function of the complete denture-wearing patient. Here are some examples of denture teeth and how they come packaged from the manufacturer. Specific molds of anterior denture teeth are identified by using a first mold number and secondly a shade for that mold number. A study has shown that on an average, the labial surface of the maxillary incisors is 8 to 10 millimeters anterior to the middle of the incisive papilla. You must keep this in mind when setting the anterior teeth. In arranging the anterior teeth, as you set each tooth, you must note the mesiodistal inclination relative to a vertical drawn to the plane of occlusion. You must note the placement of the incisal edge on the plane of occlusion also. The central incisor is placed with a slight mesial inclination of the crown. If you think about the projection of the root from the crown, then you would say that the tooth has a slightly distal inclination through the root. The maxillary lateral incisor has a slightly greater mesial inclination of the crown than the central incisor, and the incisal edge is placed about 1 millimeter above the plane of occlusion, shown by that dotted line. The canine reverts back to a slight mesial inclination of the crown, similar to that of the central incisor. The incisal edge may be placed at the same level as the lateral incisor if you wish to create a more curved smile line, or it may be placed on the plane at the same height as the central. I kind of like this choice for our flat plane setup. It depends on the smile line of the patient, though. You would want to parallel that lower lip. The mandibular incisors differ in the inclination than the mandibular maxillary incisors. The central incisor has a very slight mesial inclination of the crown to the mesial. The lateral incisor has a slightly greater mesial inclination of the crown, and the canine has a slightly greater mesial inclination than the central incisor. All of these teeth have an incisal edge that is placed on the plane. Some individuals like to rotate the teeth slightly to give a very natural appearance. Here's a photo of the anterior setup of the maxillary teeth alone on that top picture. It shows the orientation of each tooth with the amount of mesial inclination assigned to that tooth and its position on the occlusal plane. It is noted that the central incisor has a slight mesial inclination, the lateral incisor has the greatest mesial inclination of the 6 anterior teeth, and the canine reverts back to a slight mesial inclination like the central. Note that in the top picture, the canine is set, in this particular setup, on the occlusal plane. The lateral incisor is the only one raised off the plane, and that being by about 1 millimeter. The mandibular incisors show the central incisors have a slight mesial inclination of the crown. The laterals have a slightly greater mesial inclination, and the canines have the greatest mesial inclination. Note how this differs from the maxillary arch because you might be tested on that. At the same time that we're arranging the anterior teeth and giving consideration to the inclination of the teeth in a mesial-distal direction, we must also consider the labiolingual inclination compared to the vertical. The central incisor has a slight labial inclination to the vertical. When placed correctly, the tooth has a middle prominence when you view it from the side. The lateral incisor has the greatest labial inclination of the 6 teeth. When viewed from the side, it is prominent in the incisal 1/3. The canine goes in the opposite direction. It's pushed in at the incisal, with the incisal lingual to the vertical. It is placed in lingual version to the extent that it exhibits cervical prominence. The mandibular incisors exhibit a different pattern of labiolingual prominence than the maxillary incisors. The mandibular central incisor has a labial inclination to the vertical and is the most prominent of the incisors. When viewed from the side, it has a labial incisal prominence. The lateral incisor is pretty much on the same line as the vertical line running through the tooth, and when viewed from the side, it has a middle prominence. The canine is again placed with the incisal edge lingual to the vertical, and when viewed from the side, it has a cervical prominence. Before beginning to set teeth, place a dot on the middle of the incisive papilla on your maxillary cast. With a millimeter ruler placed on the median palatal suture and extending through the middle of the incisive papilla, measure 8 to 10 millimeters anterior to the middle of the incisive papilla on the cast to the land area. Place a mark perpendicular to the ruler on the land area at this 8 to 10 millimeter mark. Place a mark parallel with your ruler at that point, which will represent the midline of the arch. The labial surface of the maxillary incisors will not be set beyond this green mark. The average distance from the middle of the incisive papilla to the labial surface of the maxillary incisors has been shown by study to be 8 to 10 millimeters. Outline the retromolar pads with lines on each side of them, as shown in the yellow on the cast. Place a red line over the median of the ridge using the millimeter ruler. Extend that line onto the anterior and posterior land areas of the cast. These marks on the land area will help you when setting teeth on the posterior area. The teeth must be set with the middle groove over the crest of the ridge. Also place a horizontal mark halfway up the retromolar pad on the land area. This line will give you the height of the occlusal plane on the mandibular. Check to see that you have marked the cast landmarks that are important for setting the anterior and posterior teeth. On the maxillary, the midline, the middle of the incisive papilla, the median palatal suture, and a point 8 to 10 millimeters anterior to the middle of incisive papilla should be marked. On the mandibular, a line should be scribed on the median of the ridge. That line should extend posteriorly to the land area behind the retromolar pads. It should extend anteriorly to the land area also. A horizontal mark should be placed halfway up the retromolar pad, which defines the height of the occlusal plane. The anterior of the vestibular roll is marked on this particular cast. This defines the most anterior position the base plate can occupy. It cannot extend past this point or is subject to dislodgement by the musculature. The pin on the articulator should be inserted to the point where the dark line on the pin is level with the horizontal member of the articulator. This is the 0 point. The plastic incisal guide table is placed on the lower, which is automatically set at 0. The condylar guidance should be at 20 degrees, and the side shift should be set at 0. For setting flat plane occlusion, the articulator settings, if you're using a Hanau articulator, are shown on this particular slide. Verify that the wax rims are in correct position before you start to set teeth. The rim should be approximately 8 millimeters in width in the posterior and converge to the occlusal. They are centered over the crest of the ridge. Transfer the midline mark to the labial of the wax using a buffalo knife or the pointed end of the number 7 spatula. Extend that line onto the cast. The mandibular wax rim should be positioned over the crest of the ridge and be approximately 8 millimeters in width at the posterior area. The rim looks pretty centered on this particular slide, except it might be a little bit labial in the premolar area. The rims should converge to the occlusal. The material shown in this slide for the base plate is shellac, which is a thermoplastic material, for your information. The level of the occlusal plane should be 1/2 to 2/3 of the way up the retromolar pad. The labial should not be positioned out past the depth of the vestibule. That's the farthest point anteriorly that we will set teeth. When you made your maxillary cast rim, you made it at an angle approximately 12 to 15 degrees to the labial. This rim should not extend labial to that 8 to 10 millimeter mark that you made on the land area of your maxillary cast. If it is, adjust it and bring it to the mark on the land of the cast. Note that this is different from the mandibular, which is more straight up and down. If you adjusted the labial of your rims, transfer the midline mark to the maxillary rim. Then extend it onto the lower rim as shown in the slide. It's also a good idea to extend those marks onto the cast, as the wax may get destroyed during tooth setting. Remove wax where the central incisor is to be located. Use the number 7 or the larger spatula. Heat it up very hot in the Bunsen burner for best results. Your little automatic waxing tool that plugs in doesn't get the job done fast enough. Remove more wax than is pictured in this slide. If your wax was adjusted to the point of 8 millimeters on that maxillary land area, you need to make more depth so that you can sink that tooth into the wax to the level where the facial surface is level with the remaining wax. Place the central incisor into the wax and bring the edge of the tooth to the midline mark. Position the tooth so that the mesial distal inclination is slightly to the mesial if you're using the crown as your guide, or slightly to the distal if you envision that root extending from the end of the tooth. Rotate the tooth buccal lingually so that when you view it from the side, the middle of the tooth is the prominent surface. First, you should note the labial position of the central incisor. The most labial point is at the 8 to 10 millimeter anterior to the middle of the incisive papilla point, but it should also be positioned to create the curvature of the arch form by positioning that distal aspect to turn slightly to form the arch form. You can check the position of your incisor by turning the palatal side up and measuring from the middle of the incisive papilla to the facial or labial aspect of your incisor. For this particular patient, it's 8 millimeters in front of the middle of the incisive papilla, well within the acceptable range. Go ahead and set the second central incisor. The right central should mirror the image of the left central incisor. As you view the facial perspective of the two central incisors, the long axis shows a slight mesial inclination of the crown or a slight distal inclination of the cervical of the tooth to a vertical drawn perpendicular to the tabletop. When viewed from profile, the cervical aspect of the tooth should be slightly depressed. Note that the incisal 2/3 of the central incisors are perpendicular to the plane of occlusion. The middle of the tooth is then the most prominent aspect of the setup. In this particular patient, appropriate lip support was achieved by placing the labial surface of the central incisors on a curve coinciding with the point 8 millimeters anterior to the incisive papilla. This may vary, and in many patients, the incisors project more anteriorly, especially in those with severe resorption of the premaxilla. Continue arranging the upper anteriors by placing the two lateral incisors. Note that they turn the corner and follow the outline of the arch. Follow the occlusion rim if you have adjusted it to a reasonable arch form. The maxillary lateral incisor should be positioned with a slightly greater mesial inclination of the incisal edge or distal inclination of the root, and is usually 1/2 to 1 millimeter above the plane of occlusion. When viewed in profile, note that the lateral incisor is positioned with a slight distal inclination of the root area in relationship with the central incisor, and it turns to follow the arch form. Note again that the lateral incisor is positioned slightly above the plane of occlusion, about 1 millimeter, and that the lateral is incisally prominent from a side view, so that cervical is tucked in more. On this slide, notice how the facial surfaces follow the arch form of the ridge and the contour of the wax rim. The arch form follows the arc of a circle. Keep in mind when you set the canine that the canine turns the corner of the mouth. The only surface that is visible when you look straight on at a patient is the mesial 1/2 of the tooth. The distal incisal edge of the canine follows a line that extends through the hamular notch. The angulation is to the mesial if you talk about the crown, or to the distal if you think a projection through the root. The tooth is cervically prominent, and if you draw a line through the root and extend it forward, it would pass through the chin. When viewed in profile, the cuspid has a slight distal inclination from the perpendicular, and the incisal tip can be placed in two positions. It can be placed at the level of the lateral incisor 1 millimeter off the occlusal plane if you're trying to develop a stronger smile line, or it can be placed on the occlusal plane as shown in the picture with the arrow. I prefer this one for our setup. The finished setup should have a pleasing balanced appearance. Some choose to rotate a lateral, or both, slightly to give a more natural appearance. Notice how the cervical and incisal edges of the cuspid are aligned vertically with our yellow line. The facial surface of the cuspid, however, is canted inward at the incisal due to the prominence of the cervical area of the tooth. The cuspid has two planes on the labial surface, a mesial plane indicated by the yellow line and a distal plane, the red line. When viewed from the anterior, only the mesial plane should be visible. We are now going to set the mandibular anterior teeth. When taking your articulator and simulating protrusive movement, the two incisors should maintain kissing contact while keeping the incisal pin on the flat table. The condylar element must remain in position also. It's not acceptable for the pin to lift up as the incisors pass over one another. When setting mandibular teeth, if you cannot achieve the proper height or facial-lingual position of the tooth because of base plate interference, then a window must be cut to make room for the tooth. Remove the wax from the base plate through an area from canine to canine. Don't play around trying to adjust the base plate for one tooth at a time. You're just wasting time. Cut a window as shown in the bottom picture, making sufficient room to allow the remaining anterior teeth to be placed. Keep sufficient thickness of the triad material on the lingual and buccal of the preparation to keep the base plate from breaking. You must be careful when you cut the window or you can break the base plate. This is easier than cutting individual windows. Place tinfoil over the ridge in the area prepared for the window. This slide shows the same procedure being done on the maxillary arch, as it can be necessary on either arch. In setting the mandibular incisors and cuspids, the mesial-distal inclination is as shown on the picture above. The central incisors exhibit a slight mesial inclination of the crown. The lateral incisors have a slightly greater mesial inclination of the crown than the central incisors, and the canines have the greatest mesial inclination of the crown. Often we may choose to make the mandibular set a bit irregular in order to give it a natural look. The labiolingual inclination of the mandibular anteriors is as shown. The central is positioned slightly labial to the vertical. It is prominent in the incisal 1/3. The lateral incisor is positioned pretty much parallel to the vertical, with the middle of the crown being prominent. The canine is tipped lingually to the vertical and is prominent in the cervical 1/3. The mandibular incisor edges cannot be set more anterior than the depth of the vestibule, or tipping of the denture will occur in function. Overbite is the vertical overlap which is measured from the incisal edge of the maxillary tooth to the incisal edge of the mandibular tooth. This is shown by the measurement between the green lines. Overjet is the amount of horizontal overlap measured from the incisal edge of the maxillary tooth to the incisal edge of the mandibular tooth. This is shown in red on the image. Overbite affects guidance and the incisal guide table contact. Patients with skeletal class 1 relationship exhibit a vertical overlap of 1 to 2 millimeters. They have a horizontal overlap of 1 to 2 millimeters and have no contact in centric occlusion. When using occlusal schemes with bilateral balance, the amount of vertical and horizontal overlap will vary depending upon the condylar inclination, the incisal guidance, the occlusal plane inclination, the cuspal inclination, and the compensating curve. All of these also will be affected by the aesthetic needs. If you wish more information about occlusal schemes and how the different settings affect the bilaterally balanced setup, review the lecture on Hanau's quint and occlusal schemes. These will be covered in more detail next semester in Clinical Complete Dentures 1. Right now, we're just getting you ready for those courses. Patients with skeletal class 1 relationships. Why do we worry about horizontal and vertical overlap? We first desire to minimize the forces that are applied to the mandibular and maxillary anterior ridges in centric occlusion. We create the appropriate relationships of the maxillary and mandibular anterior teeth during the production of sibilant sounds, which we test with our record bases and occlusion rims. These will help us determine the proper placement of the anterior teeth. In the Angles Class 2 patient, the mandible tends to travel farther anteriorly in function than the typical Class 1 patient, and consequently, more horizontal overlap is necessary to allow for this functional movement. In contrast, the Class 3 patients often demonstrate little or no anterior movement of the mandible during function. Consequently, little or no horizontal overlap is developed in this patient setup. During the production of sibilant sounds, the S sounds, as in 66, 77, the mandible travels down and forward, and a space of about 1 millimeter is created between the maxillary and mandibular incisors during the making of these sounds. Look at the image on the left and on the right. The individual is making S sounds. We test our tentative tooth placement position with the use of our occlusal rims when we try them in the mouth. In most patients, the labial surface of the mandibular incisors should be roughly perpendicular to the occlusal plane. The central incisors are usually slightly labially inclined, with the prominence being at the incisal 1/3. In the setup shown here, the initial vertical overlap chosen was 1 millimeter, and the amount of horizontal overlap was 1.5 millimeters. Whether this is correct depends upon when you place this lower in protrusion. It must have kissing contact with the upper incisors. The horizontal overlap is measured from the maxillary palato-incisal line angle to the mandibular labio-incisal line angle. The incisal angle varies depending upon the magnitude of the vertical and horizontal overlap, the arrangement of the occlusal plane, and the condylar inclination. It is generally advisable to keep that incisal angle to a minimum in complete dentures. In our setup, that angle may be as little as 0 degrees. We'll have to see how a 20-degree condylar inclination affects our incisal angle. As you arrange the mandibular teeth, you should arrange one tooth and then take the articulator into protrusive and lateral movements. Establish kissing contact with the upper anteriors. Do not try to set all of the teeth and then work out the movements. It will take you far longer to do it this way than if you do it with each individual tooth. While setting the anterior teeth, be sure to set each one individually. Work out the mesial-distal inclination and the labiolingual inclination while keeping them at the desired occlusal height. Try to establish a 1 millimeter vertical overlap in order to get better aesthetics. If not, if it won't work out with our settings, then go ahead and make a 0 overlap. Remember that partly depends on how much horizontal overlap you have. Next, check the protrusive and lateral movements. The teeth must have kissing contact. Also watch to make sure that you don't get any wax on the wax occlusal rims, or you'll change the vertical dimension. The pin must stay at the 0 mark, and it must stay in contact with the incisal guide table. This picture shows a lateral incisor with a slight mesial-distal inclination, and it's relatively parallel to the vertical drawn to the occlusal plane. It has a middle prominence when viewed from the side. Remember that the incisal guide pin always has to stay in touch with the guide table. The incisors should follow the arch form of the wax. The teeth should be set with a 1 millimeter overjet and preferably a 1 millimeter overbite. Your pin cannot come up off the table, though, when you go into protrusive. Position the remaining mandibular anterior teeth. The lateral incisors should be placed with a middle prominence compared to the incisal prominence of the central incisors. Note that the cuspids are toed in at the cervical. The vertical overlap can be easily appreciated from a frontal perspective. Here is what the case will look like in the protrusive and lateral excursions. Both movements will show that there is kissing contact between the upper and lower anterior teeth. On this completed arrangement, the overjet is approximately 1 millimeter. The overbite may be 1 millimeter or very little or non-existent, with the incisal guide table and the plane being so totally flat. The teeth will show symmetry on the arc of the circle. The canines point back to the retromolar pad. Here is just a quick reminder of the mesial and distal inclinations of the incisors and the canines on the maxillary and mandibular arch. Be sure to memorize the prominences of the anterior teeth. Remember, the maxillary central is middle prominent, lateral incisal prominent, canine cervical prominent. The mandibulars go in order, so the central incisors are incisally prominent, laterals middle prominent, and the canines cervically prominent. When you look at the maxillary and mandibular arch forms above that are developed for the setup, the middle groove of the posterior teeth will be set along the red lines that have been established on these designs. In protrusive, the teeth should have kissing contact. Please note how nicely the casts have been cleaned up, as well as the occlusion rims and the wax around the teeth. There will be kissing contact on lateral movement also. This picture on the left illustrates what lateral movement looks like when the canine is set at the height of the lateral incisor. The one on the right demonstrates setting the canine on the same level plane as the central incisor. I think that makes for a more aesthetic setup. Check to make sure that your pin has not moved. It must still be on the 0 mark, and the contact must be made with the guide plate, with the little guide table. When you transfer this set back to your dentiform, the distance between those two reference points that we started out with should be 30 millimeters.